The music pulsed through the crowded bar, bass thumping in time with the nerves racing in Amelia's chest. She had insisted on coming alone tonight, wanting to prove to herself that she didn't need anyone, especially her husband's shadow, to enjoy a night out. But as soon as she stepped onto the dance floor in her shimmering midnight blue gown, the whispers started. At first, it was subtle, a few stifled laughs from a corner booth. Then she felt it, the eyes of a group of men sizing her up, their smirks growing wider with every step she took. She tried to ignore them, gliding past the tables with the elegance she'd been taught, but the men weren't satisfied with whispers. One of them, tall with a cruel twist to his lips, stepped forward, his friends circling like predators. Well, looks like someone's trying a little too hard, he sneered. That dress, think it can handle a little fun? Before she could react, another grabbed the hem of her gown. The fabric tore with a loud rip that made heads turn, and Amelia gasped, the sharp sound of silk tearing echoing in her ears. Panic surged through her, and her hands flew to cover the damage, but the damage was done. Her gown, her pride, and her confidence had all been shredded in an instant. The men laughed, their voices thick with arrogance. Oops, looks like we found the weak link, one jeered. Guess someone can't handle a little attention. Amelia's face burned, not from the heat of embarrassment, but from the surge of helplessness she felt. She wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd, but fear had frozen her in place. She could feel the judgmental stares of strangers, the curious whispers cutting through the air, making her chest tighten like a vice. And then, as if the universe had decided she'd suffered enough, the doors of the bar swung open with a commanding force. Heads turned as a figure stepped in, tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating authority. The crowd seemed to part instinctively, making way for him as he approached. It was her husband, Alexander Cole, a man whose presence could silence a room without a word. Billionaire, power broker, and the kind of man who seemed untouchable, he strode in with calm certainty. His eyes locked onto Amelia, and in them was a mix of concern, disbelief, and the cold spark of wrath that had made headlines in the business world. The men who had just tormented her didn't notice him at first, still basking in their cruel triumph. But then Alexander's gaze shifted to them. A slow, predatory smile curved his lips, and the air around him seemed to thicken with danger. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low, smooth, but carrying a weight that made every word tremble in the air. "I believe you've been a little disrespectful." One of the men laughed nervously, trying to mask the sudden unease creeping up his spine. "And who's going to stop us?" "You," he said, though the bravado in his voice was faltering. Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the bar's music faded into the background as if it, too, feared his wrath. Finally, he spoke, calm but lethal. "Yes, I am. And I assure you, by the time I'm done, you'll be begging for mercy you didn't know you had to offer." The men exchanged uneasy glances, their previous confidence crumbling. One of them took a step back, only to bump into another patron, who gave him a warning glare. Alexander's reputation preceded him, everyone in the room sensed it. Amelia felt a shiver run down her spine, a mix of relief and awe. She had never seen him like this, not in a boardroom, not in public, never in the quiet intimacy of their home. But tonight, she realized, he was a different kind of force. He was her shield, her protector, and the embodiment of the consequences they'd never imagined. Alexander's eyes narrowed on the ringleader, the man who had first touched her gown. "You've made a grave mistake," he said. "And mistakes like this, they're costly." The man's bravado faltered completely. He tried to form words, but all that came out was a croak. The others around him shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of the power imbalance. What had seemed like harmless mischief a moment ago now felt like the first chapter in a disaster they couldn't escape. Alexander didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the men sweat under the bar's neon lights. He moved with calculated steps, closing the distance with each one until they were cornered, not by walls, but by inevitability. Consider this a lesson, Alexander continued, his tone chillingly calm. Some actions have repercussions, and some people should never test me. The men finally understood. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by fear so tangible it seemed to vibrate through the room. One of them dropped to his knees, his hands raised in an instinctive plea. Please, we didn't mean anything. I'm sorry. The rest quickly followed, muttering apologies and stammering confessions, the reality of their helplessness washing over them like a cold tide. Alexander surveyed them with a piercing gaze, ensuring every single one felt the weight of his presence and the gravity of their actions. Then, with a single glance toward Amelia, the tension shifted. Her husband extended a hand, helping her straighten the ruined gown and brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. The warmth of his touch was a stark contrast to the icy fear still radiating from the men at their feet. Amelia's lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you." Alexander simply nodded, his eyes returning to the men. "Remember this night," he said softly, though everyone could hear. "And remember the lesson, never underestimate the consequences of cruelty. Never." With that, he guided Amelia toward the exit, each step purposeful and dignified. The men remained kneeling, humiliated and broken, as the bar slowly resumed its rhythm around them. But the memory of Alexander's presence, the way he had made them beg, the way he had turned fear into a lesson, would haunt them for a lifetime. Outside, the cool night air hit Amelia's face, and she finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked up at him, at the man who had made the impossible seem effortless. You saved me," she said softly, awe and gratitude mingling in her voice. Alexander's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "No," he replied gently. "You saved yourself by simply showing up. I just reminded them of their place." And as they walked into the quiet of the night, hand in hand, Amelia realized something profound. She had entered that bar alone, but she would never feel powerless again, not with him, not with the truth she now carried. The night after the incident at the bar, Amelia couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, the laughter, the tearing of her gown, the surge of humiliation that had left her trembling. She had never felt so exposed, so utterly vulnerable, and yet so alive when Alexander had walked in. The contrast between fear and relief left her restless, her body tangled in the sheets, her thoughts a storm she couldn't calm. By mid-morning, she found herself wandering through the quiet streets near their penthouse, the city just beginning to stir. The incident at the bar had made her hyper-aware of her own strength, and she realized she wanted more than just protection, she wanted empowerment, a reclaiming of her dignity that no one could take from her again. The torn gown had been symbolic. It was more than silk ripped apart. It was a reminder that vulnerability didn't equal weakness, and strength didn't always come from fists or money, it came from the courage to face the world, even when it was cruel. Meanwhile, Alexander was already at his office, reviewing merger documents with the precision and intensity that had built him his fortune. But even surrounded by charts and legal briefs, his mind kept returning to last night. He had seen the fear in those men's eyes, the desperation as they realized they were powerless. Yet, beneath the satisfaction of seeing justice delivered, there was something deeper stirring within him, a desire to ensure Amelia never felt unsafe again, a need to turn last night's ordeal into a lesson not just for her attackers, but for the world around them. By noon, word had begun to spread. In the high-powered circles Alexander moved in, rumors traveled faster than wildfire. "Did you hear about Amelia at the bar last night?" Whispered voices circulated in corporate lounges and exclusive clubs. Some spoke in hushed admiration, others in thinly veiled envy. But no one doubted the truth. Alexander Cole had made an unforgettable entrance, and his actions had left an indelible mark on anyone who had witnessed them, or heard about them. Back at their penthouse, Amelia tried to busy herself with work, but the phone kept ringing. Calls from friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances who had heard fragments of the story demanded her attention. She answered as many as she could, keeping her tone composed, but every question, every gasp of disbelief or admiration, pulled at her nerves. The emotional adrenaline from last night hadn't worn off, it had only shifted into a quiet, simmering awareness of her own resilience. Then, the bar incident took an unexpected turn. Social media had picked up footage from someone's phone, a shaky video capturing the men laughing, the rip of the gown, and Alexandra's dramatic entrance. By evening, it was trending across platforms, news outlets, gossip columns, and even late-night shows dissecting the event. Headlines ranged from sensational to outraged: billionaire saves wife from bar bullies, Amelia Cole stands tall in torn gown, the night Alexander Cole made them beg. Amelia felt a mixture of embarrassment and empowerment as she scrolled through the coverage. Comments flooded in, some praising her poise, others criticizing her for going out alone, but the overwhelming theme was admiration for the couple's strength and composure. She realized the world had witnessed not just an act of protection, but a statement: cruelty would not go unchallenged, and dignity was worth defending. That evening, as they returned from a quiet dinner, Alexander suggested they visit the bar, not to confront the men again, but to reclaim the space. Amelia hesitated, but his hand on her back, warm and reassuring, gave her courage. The bar had returned to its usual hum of music and chatter, but the atmosphere felt different to her now. It was no longer intimidating, it was just a place where an incident had once happened, and nothing more. They approached the bartender, a young man who had nervously looked on during the previous night's chaos. "Can we have a word?" Alexander asked politely. The bartender nodded, leading them to a quiet corner. "The men who tore your dress?" Alexander began, his voice calm but commanding. "Are they still coming around here?" The bartender swallowed hard. "No, sir. Ever since last night, word's gotten out. They haven't been back. And the others, well, everyone's treating them differently now." He paused, glancing at Amelia. "Honestly, ma'am, people are saying, you should be proud. You didn't cry, didn't run, you stood there." Amelia's cheeks flushed. She hadn't realized her presence had made such an impact. "I felt terrified," she admitted softly, "but I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart." Alexander nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "That's exactly why I stepped in. Not because you couldn't handle it, but because I refused to let anyone diminish what you're worth. You never have to face fear alone, but facing it with grace, that's what leaves a mark." As they left the bar, Amelia noticed the subtle changes in the environment. The regular patrons who had once ignored her now offered smiles and nods of respect. Staff whispered about her composure, and even a few of the men who had once laughed now kept their distance, their expressions a mixture of shame and lingering awe. The dynamic had shifted completely, and Amelia felt a wave of vindication washing over her. That night, back in the penthouse, Alexander and Amelia sat together, reviewing the events of the past 24 hours. "You've changed," he observed, his eyes soft but discerning. "Last night didn't break you, it transformed you." Amelia smiled faintly, feeling the truth of his words settle within her. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to be unshakable. Not because nothing scares me, but because I've seen what it takes to confront fear, and survive it with dignity." Alexander leaned closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "And I'll be here every step of the way. Not to fight your battles for you, but to make sure no one ever tries to diminish your strength again." Amelia rested her head against his shoulder, comforted by the certainty of his words. She thought of the bar, of the men now forced to confront their own humiliation, and of the power that came not from money, but from presence, courage, and unyielding self-respect. Last night had been terrifying, but today had been victorious. She understood now that strength wasn't always loud, and justice didn't always need chaos. Sometimes, it arrived simply by walking in and standing tall. In the quiet of their apartment, Amelia reflected on the lessons she had learned. Fear could be confronted, cruelty could be repelled, and dignity, no matter how tested, could always be reclaimed. And most importantly, she realized that true power lay not in the hands of the aggressors, but in those who refused to be broken.